I walked into the private dining room still carrying the smell of another man's kitchen on my clothes, and Celeste Harrow looked at me the way people look at something that has wandered in through the wrong entrance. "Excuse me," she said, not to me, but to the two security men stationed near the doorway. "He's not on my list. Please escort him out." I stopped where I was. I didn't reach for my phone to show her the confirmation email sitting in my inbox. I didn't raise my voice or ask her to look twice. I have spent 58 years learning exactly when arguing costs you more than it earns you, so I simply stepped back and let the room hold its breath around me. That's when Marcus Delane stood up. He rose slowly from his chair, cloth napkin still folded in one hand, and looked at Celeste with an expression somewhere between disappointment and disbelief. "If he isn't," sitting Marcus said, "neither am I." Celeste blinked. For a woman who had built an entire company on reading a room before it knew what it wanted, she looked for the first time all evening like she was reading nothing at all. "My name is Isaiah Booker. I am 58 years old, a black single father who raised my daughter alone after her mother passed, and somewhere in the years of packed lunches, late-night homework, and learning to braid hair from grainy internet videos at midnight, I built a quiet career doing something most people never notice until it's already gone wrong. I find the places where a business is bleeding money, trust, or time, and I stop the bleeding before anyone with a title ever sees the wound." I had come to that dinner directly from a diner 2 miles away, where the owner, a woman named Priya, who had inherited the place from her father, called me in a panic because her walk-in cooler had failed on a Friday afternoon during a heat wave. She was staring down $11,000 in spoiled inventory and a Saturday she couldn't afford to lose. It took me 14 minutes to find the actual problem, a failed compressor relay, not the unit itself, and save her from an $18,000 replacement she didn't need. I hosed the grease off my hands in her back sink, checked my watch, and realized I had exactly enough time to make the dinner if I drove straight there without stopping to change. That is the work. Nobody photographs it. Nobody puts it in a brochure. I still had a faint smear of condenser grease on my cuff when I walked into Celeste Harrow's dining room in my plain gray button-down, my work boots, because it had never once occurred to me that showing up honest would need an apology attached to it. Celeste had never met me in person. She had only seen my name in the margins of contracts, a line item, a reference, an approval pending attached to deals worth more to her career than almost anything else she had built. When a man walked through her door dressed like he'd come from a loading dock instead of a boardroom, she made her decision in under 3 seconds. It was the same kind of fast, confident red that had probably served her correctly 100 times before, in 100 rooms exactly like this one. This was the one time it didn't. I should say, too, that I had noticed the maitre d' at the entrance eyeing me the same way a few minutes earlier, before waving me through without a word, assuming I was there to fix something in the kitchen rather than sit at the table. I hadn't corrected him either. I've learned over the years that correcting a stranger's first assumption rarely changes anything about how they treat you for the rest of the evening, and I would rather save my energy for the moments that actually matter. I had no idea, standing in that entryway, that the next assumption would come from the one person in the building whose opinion of me was actually attached to $40 million in decisions. "There's been a misunderstanding," I told her, keeping my voice level. "I'm one of your invited guests tonight. This dinner," she said, still composed, still certain, "is restricted to invited executives and their principal clients. I don't have any record of you." "Check again," I said, and stepped further back, giving her the room to be wrong quietly if she chose to. She didn't choose quiet. She chose to let the whole table watch. A second client rose, then a third, then a fourth, chairs scraping back one after another until 7 people representing close to $40 million in prospective partnerships were standing in perfect, unplanned refusal. Celeste's confidence cracked into something closer to alarm. I watched her eyes move from face to face, searching for the one person who might sit back down and give her an exit from the moment. Nobody did. "What is this?" she asked the room, and underneath the polish I heard something new. Fear, maybe, or the very beginning of it. Nobody answered directly. Renata Cole, who owned 3 award-winning restaurants across the historic district, finally said, "You'll want to talk to your assistant about the guest list, Celeste." All of it. Celeste's assistant scrolled his tablet with visibly shaking hands and found my name in seconds, not buried, but referenced 3 separate times in the preliminary partnership documents, each time attached to the same phrase, "Pending Isaiah Booker's independent review and approval." I watched the color drain from her face as she read it over his shoulder. She had built this dinner around an evening she believed she controlled completely, and buried in her own paperwork was the name of the man she had just ordered thrown out of the room. She asked to speak with me privately. I agreed, because a public argument was never going to fix what had already happened, and I've never once believed humiliating a person in front of an audience makes them better even when they've earned it. We stood near a service hallway, away from the clatter of the kitchen, the smell of searing butter and rosemary drifting past us. "I owe you an apology," she said, and to her credit, she said it without performance. "I made an assumption." "You did," I said. "But that's not really what bothers me." She waited. "Being turned away, I've had worse things happen to me for smaller reasons than the clothes on my back," I said. "What bothers me is that in the 2 minutes I stood in front of you, you never once asked who I was. You looked at what I was wearing and decided you already knew everything you needed to know about my worth in that room. That decision took you 3 seconds. It's taken me 40 years to build a name that shouldn't have needed defending in the first place." She didn't defend herself. She nodded, slowly, like the sentence was heavier than she expected it to be. "Why do they trust? You like this?" she asked. "I've spent 18 months building relationships with these people, courting every one of them personally. You walked in wearing work boots and half of them stood up before you said a single word." "That's a longer conversation," I said. "The short version is this. Before any of them agreed to bring their businesses into your expansion, they made an agreement among themselves. Nothing legal, nothing binding on paper. They simply promised each other that none of them would sign anything until I had looked at it independently and given them my honest read. My approval carries no legal weight in your contracts, Ms. Harrow. It carries something else." "What?" "Trust that took years to build, and that I've never once spent carelessly." Renata found us before Celeste could answer, apparently unwilling to let her hear the rest secondhand. "You should know the real reason, Celeste," she said. 6 years ago, my second restaurant was 2 months from closing. A supplier had me locked into a contract, quietly draining 30% of my margins, buried in language I'd have needed a law degree to catch. I was desperate enough that night to sign almost anything that promised relief. Isaiah found the actual problem in an afternoon. He didn't renegotiate it himself. He simply showed me exactly what to say and to whom, and stayed on the phone with me while I made the call so I wouldn't lose my nerve. He never charged me a dime beyond his normal rate, and when I offered him a piece of the business afterward, out of pure gratitude, he turned it down flat, without even taking a full day to think about it. Marcus added, quieter, he did the same for 3 of us in this room, at 3 different points, in 3 different kinds of trouble. Mine was a lease dispute that would have shut my flagship in for an entire season, right in the middle of our busiest year. A property management company had slipped a maintenance clause into the renewal that made me responsible for structural repairs that were legally theirs to cover. Isaiah spotted it during what was supposed to be a 20-minute Favor over coffee, nothing formal. He didn't bill me for it. He barely let me thank him properly, before he was already asking about my staffing for the season instead, like the favor wasn't worth dwelling on. That's not luck, Celeste. That's a pattern, built one honest afternoon at a time. And a man who builds a pattern like that doesn't deserve the way you treated him tonight, not in front of us, and not anywhere else either. Something shifted in Celeste's face, not defeat, recognition. Devon Ashcroft, still standing near the far end of the table, crossed his arms. For what it's worth, Celeste, I flew in for this dinner. I turned down a supplier meeting in Denver to be here tonight. If this is how you treat people the moment they don't look like what you expected, I need to think seriously about whether I want my roasteries tied to your company for the next 5 years, contract or no contract. It was the first real threat spoken aloud that evening, the first sign that this wasn't simply an awkward moment that would smooth itself over with a gracious apology and a good bottle of wine. Devon meant it. I could hear it in the flatness of his voice, the absence of any performance in it. Give her the chance to actually fix it before you decide that, I said before Celeste could respond. Walking away tonight solves nothing for you either, Devon. It just leaves this financing structure sitting on someone else's desk, unexamined, waiting to catch the next person who trusts the wrong presentation deck. Devon studied me for a long moment, then nodded once and sat back down, though his arms stayed crossed. It wasn't forgiveness. It was patience, on loan, with interest attached. So what happens now? She asked. Do you walk away and let the whole deal collapse in front of everyone? I won't pretend the thought of simply leaving hadn't crossed my mind, of letting the consequences of her first order land exactly where they should, and driving home to the quiet of my own kitchen table without looking back. But that isn't the man I've spent 58 years trying to become, and it isn't the example I want my grown daughter to be able to point to and say, that's my father. That's what he does when someone wrongs him. The dinner should continue, I said, but only if everyone at that table understands exactly what they're agreeing to, not the version in the presentation deck, the real one. She agreed, relieved and bracing herself in the same breath. We returned to the table, though I asked for 15 minutes and the full partnership documents before I would sit, not the summary decks her team had prepared for the evening, but the complete versions. Financing structures included every appendix and footnote. Celeste handed them over without hesitation, and that told me something the earlier moment hadn't. She was capable of humility once her ego stopped standing directly in front of it. It took closer to 25 minutes, reading quietly in the corner while dinner cooled on warming trays and ate nervous business. Owners pretended not to watch me over the rims of their water glasses. What I found wasn't scandalous. Nobody in the room was lying, but buried 3 layers into the expansion structure was a financing arrangement that would lock every smaller business into a 5-year revenue sharing clause disguised as a growth partnership fee. It looked reasonable against a single year's projection and became crushing by year 3, particularly for the 2 restaurant owners whose margins were already thin as paper, and devastating by year 5 for anyone whose growth didn't outpace the compounding rate baked quietly into the fine print. There were 2 smaller problems folded into the same document, ones that on their own wouldn't have raised alarms, but stacked together told a clearer story. The exclusivity clause quietly prevented any client from bringing in outside consultants for operational reviews once the partnership began, meaning that after signing, none of them could have called someone like me again without breaching their own contract. And the exit terms, 4 pages further in, imposed a penalty for early termination steep enough that no business owner would ever realistically use the escape hatch the document claimed to offer them, no matter how badly they might need it in year 2 or year 3. None of it was illegal. All of it was designed, whether anyone at Celeste's company intended it that way or not, to make sure that once someone signed, they stayed signed, whether the partnership kept serving them or not. I laid it out plainly when I returned to the table, not to embarrass Celeste, but because the people trusting her deserved to understand the actual shape of what they were about to sign their names to. She turned red, then pale, then something steadier. That structure came from our finance team, she said. I didn't design it to trap anyone. I believe you, I said. But intention doesn't change what it does to the people who sign it without understanding it. A trap doesn't need a builder who meant harm. It only needs people who never got shown where the floor gives way. For a moment I thought she might retreat into the polished certainty that had carried her this far in her career. Instead, she asked the question that told me she might actually deserve the second chance the room was quietly offering her. How do we fix it without losing the deal? Before we could begin, her phone lit up twice in quick succession on the table beside her, and I watched her jaw tighten as she read the screen. Her chairman was calling. Word of the scene at dinner had already reached the board. Someone at the table, or someone's assistant, had already sent a version of what happened out into the world. And now the man who had championed her expansion strategy for 2 years wanted an explanation before the story reached a single reporter or investor group. They think I've lost the room, she said quietly, more to herself than to me. If I can't hold these 8 people together tonight, the board pulls my authority over the entire expansion by Monday morning. 2 years of work gone because of 3 seconds at a doorway. That was the moment the evening's stakes changed shape entirely. This was no longer only about an insult undone or a contract quietly corrected. Celeste's career, the thing she had built her entire adult life around, was now genuinely on the line, and every choice she made for the rest of that night would either rebuild the room's trust in her or finish what her first mistake had started. Then let's fix what's actually true, I said, instead of managing what people believe. We worked through the financing structure together, restructuring the compounding fee into a flat, transparent percentage tied to real, verifiable growth instead of a clause hidden in language most people would never read twice. I walked each client through exactly what would change in their individual agreements. In plain terms, answering every question without rushing anyone toward a signature, sketching simple numbers on the back of a menu card so nobody had to take my word for anything they couldn't see for themselves. It was Marcus, near the end of that conversation, who told Celeste the one piece I hadn't planned on anyone sharing that night. You should also know, he said, that Isaiah could have been a wealthy man years ago. 3 of us offered him real ownership stakes after he saved our businesses. Meaningful percentages, not token gestures. He turned every one of us down. Celeste looked at me, genuinely startled. Why? Because the moment people believe my advice benefits me financially, it stops being worth anything to them, I said. I decided a long time ago that staying independent mattered more than being comfortable. My daughter grew up watching me turn down money more than once, watching me choose the harder, poorer, more honest road instead of the easier one. I wanted her to understand that some things are worth more than a bigger house or a nicer car. I still believe that, even on nights when the smaller house feels a little emptier than it used to. Celeste was quiet for a long moment, turning that over. Then her phone buzzed again, the chairman, a second time, and she silenced it without looking. A small gesture that told me more about her than anything she'd said all night. Let him wait, she said. This matters more right now. The chairman didn't wait quietly. 15 minutes later, his name lit up her screen a third time, and this time she answered, stepping just far enough from the table that her voice dropped, but didn't disappear entirely. I caught pieces of it, his voice sharp and tinny through the speaker. Something about optics. Something about how a public collapse at this stage could spook the 2 institutional investors who were watching the expansion from a distance, waiting to see whether it was worth their own money once the smaller partnerships were locked in. I watched Celeste's shoulders square themselves. The same posture I imagine she used the first time she ever had to defend a decision in a room full of men who assumed they knew better. "I'm not walking away from this table until it's fixed properly," I heard her say, clearly enough that Renata and I exchanged a glance. "If that costs us a few days of headlines, that's a smaller cost than losing every client sitting in this room permanently, which is exactly what happens if I rush this the way you're asking me to." She hung up without waiting for his answer, came back, and sat back down beside her clients as though nothing had happened at all, though her hand wasn't quite steady around her water glass for a minute or two afterward. Nobody at the table mentioned it. I think we all understood, without needing to say so, that we had just watched her choose the harder version of that phone call over the easier one, and that the choice had cost her something real. We spent nearly 2 hours at that table, long after the food had gone cold and been quietly replaced twice by an anxious kitchen staff who kept glancing through the service door, unsure whether to interrupt. I answered every question the clients raised, including the hard ones, including one from a younger client named Devin Ashcroft, who ran a growing chain of specialty coffee roasteries and had the most to gain and the most to lose from the night's outcome. "I'll be honest," Devin said, arms crossed, studying me the way a man studies a stranger he's been told to trust. "I don't know you. I've heard your name in passing, that's all. Why should tonight change anything for me? It shouldn't. On my word alone," I said. "Ask Marcus. Ask Renata. Ask anyone at this table who's needed me before. Then decide for yourself whether the pattern is real and whether it's worth trusting with your business." Devin looked around the table at the others nodding quiet and certain, and something in his posture eased just slightly. "Fine," he said, "but I'll want 48 hours before I sign anything. Not because I don't trust the new numbers, because I want to read them myself, slowly the way I should have read the first version 3 weeks ago, before any of us walked in here tonight." Celeste didn't push back, not even a flicker of the old instinct to close, to chase, to control the moment toward a signature. "Take the time you need," she said. "All of you." That single sentence, more than any apology, seemed to settle something in the room. She wasn't chasing a deadline anymore. She was finally protecting the relationship instead of the transaction sitting inside it. Near the end of the evening, Renata asked the question I think everyone at that table had been circling for hours without quite landing on it. "Isaiah, why did you agree to review this deal at all, if you never take a stake in anything? What's actually in it for you?" I thought about how to answer that honestly, and for a moment the room went quiet enough that I could hear the kitchen doors swinging somewhere behind us. 15 years ago, before any of you knew my name, I watched a friend of mine sign away his restaurant to a partnership that looked exactly like tonight's original paperwork, I said. Same kind of language, same kind of promise. He lost everything within 4 years, and by the time he understood what had happened, it was too late to undo any of it. I wasn't skilled enough yet to see what was hidden in those pages. I couldn't help him. I've spent every year since making sure that doesn't happen again to anyone who trusts me enough to ask. Nobody spoke for a moment after that. My friend's name was Walter. He'd run a small chain of hardware stores, 3 of them, built up over 20 years from nothing but a single storefront and a line of credit he'd nearly killed himself paying off. I was still young in this work when he signed his stores into a partnership almost identical to the one sitting in front of Celeste's clients that night, the same kind of compounding fee, the same kind of exclusivity clause quietly closing every door he might have used to get a second opinion. I remember sitting in his kitchen the week he told me what he'd signed, watching him try to convince himself it would be fine, and not having the knowledge yet to tell him otherwise. 4 years later, he lost all 3 stores. He moved out of state not long after that, and we lost touch the way people do when the thing between them has gone too painful to keep visiting. I think about him more than I let on. Every contract I've read since has some small piece of Walter's kitchen table folded into how carefully I read it. Celeste finally stood, and instead of returning to her seat at the head of the table, she asked her assistant to move her name card to the side, among her clients as an equal rather than someone positioned above them, above the whole conversation the way she'd been positioned all evening. "Sit with us, Isaiah," she said. "Not because I'm asking as your host tonight, because I'd like you to actually see how this conversation ends, from inside it instead of outside it." I hesitated. Old instincts, old habits about staying out of rooms that were never built with men like me at their center. Then I sat, not because she was powerful, not because the room demanded it of me, but because for the first time all evening, she understood something that had nothing to do with a seating chart, a title, or a company logo etched into the glassware in front of her. The revised terms weren't signed that night. Celeste insisted on it. Every client would take the corrected documents, home read them without pressure, ask their own attorneys whatever questions they needed to ask, and walk away entirely if that was the right choice for their business. 3 weeks later, all 8 had signed. Not one of them walked away, but every one of them signed knowing exactly what they were agreeing to, which had never been true of the first version placed in front of them. I saw Celeste again months later, at a much smaller dinner. No cameras, no rehearsed opening remarks about growth and shared vision. Her chairman had, in the end, backed her handling of the crisis once the deal closed on stronger footing than it had ever had before, and the expansion was already outperforming its early projections, this time without a single client feeling like they'd been maneuvered into anything they didn't fully understand. "The most damaging mistake I made that night," she told me quietly, turning her glass in slow circles, watching the light move through it, "wasn't ordering you out of the room. It was assuming I already knew your value before I knew a single thing about your story. I built my entire career reading rooms in seconds. That night taught me some people can't be read that fast, and shouldn't have to be." I told her I never needed a seat at anyone's table to prove who I was. I never had. But watching her say it, watching the careful, deliberate way she chose each word, I understood the realization mattered to her far more than any apology could have. Her clients hadn't refused to sit that night because they were loyal to my status. I have no status, not in the way that room usually measured it. They refused because, over years of quiet, unglamorous work, I had earned something sturdier than a title or a place at the head of a table. I had earned their trust in exactly who I am, grease-stained cuffs and all, and no seating chart, however carefully arranged, was ever going to be the thing that decided whether that trust deserved a seat in the room. I told my daughter about that night over the phone the following weekend, the way I tell her most things now that she has her own apartment across town and her own life filling up the spaces I used to fill for her. She laughed when I described the look on Celeste's face, and then went quiet when I got to the part about Walter, the way she always does when that name comes up. "You never took the ownership stakes," she said. "Not quite a question. Even after all that." "No," I told her. "And I never will. That's not the kind of rich I've been trying to become." "What kind is that?" "The kind where a room full of strangers stands up for you without being asked," I said. I didn't know that was possible until it happened in front of me. I still don't fully understand it, but I know it's worth more than anything I turned down to get it. She didn't say anything for a moment, and I could hear, faintly, the sound of her own kitchen in the background, a kettle, a cabinet closing, the small, ordinary noises of a life I helped build but no longer occupy the center of the way it should be. "I'm proud of you, Dad," she finally said, and I sat with that for a long moment after we hung up, turning it over slowly, the way Celeste had turned her glass in slow circles at that small, quiet dinner months later. I have never needed a seat at the head of anyone's table to know who I am. I learned that a long time before Celeste Harrow ever looked at me across her dining room and decided, in 3 seconds, that she already knew. She was wrong that night, in front of everyone who mattered to her career. But she was right about one thing in the end, whether she meant to be or not. Some things really can't be read that fast. And on the night she tried to remove me from her table, that was the one thing not even her security guards could take away.